Good morning, colleagues, and thank you to everyone joining us this morning. Welcome to this UUKi International webinar, where we'll be launching our latest report covering outbound student mobility. My name is Harry Anderson, and I am the Deputy Director for Policy and Global Engagement at UUKi International, and I'll be chairing today's webinar. This webinar marks the launch of our latest report in a series of reports which are known as our Gone International series. The series explores those who study, work or volunteer overseas as part of their degree. And for those of you who might be less familiar, we originally ran this series from 2015 to 2019 when we published a number of Gone International reports, all of which explored outbound student mobility in an attempt to better understand the experiences of those UK-based students who spend a period of time overseas during their studies. This latest report follows a pause in the series since 2019, when the sudden arrival of the pandemic and a rather tumultuous period meant that we felt it was better to pause. We saw during this period not only global travel disruption caused by the pandemic, but also the UK's departure from the EU and the introduction of a new immigration system, as well as the UK's exit from the Erasmus scheme and the creation of new approaches such as the Turing and TAFE schemes. That's why now we've decided it's a good time to restart the series and understand how these trends have impacted on outbound mobility. It's also why we're calling this latest report Gone International a New Generation, as this really is a new generation of student mobility. However, while the context may have changed, I think this new report really reaffirms the value of global mobility for students and helps demonstrate that those who undertake mobility benefit not only through seeing the world, but in a whole host of other ways, like being more likely to be awarded a first-class degree, more likely to secure professional level jobs, and more likely to enjoy higher graduate earnings than compared to their non-mobile peers. I will shortly be handing over to my colleague, Charlie Robinson, who is our Head of Global Mobility, who will be able to talk through these findings in far more detail. But beforehand, let me introduce the rest of the panel. I'm delighted that this morning we are joined by Dr. Malcolm Butler, who is the Vice President and Director of International at the University of Sheffield, as well as Chair of the Northern Consortium Board. Malcolm will provide some reflections on the report and how universities can support a wide range of students in pursuing mobilities. Alongside Malcolm is Dr. Lucy van Essen-Fishman, who is Policy and Research Manager at Jisc. And Lucy will be talking about the importance of high quality data which underpins this report. Before we go any further, I also want to use this as an opportunity to put on record our deepest gratitude to both the Northern Consortium and Jisc for their generous support, advice and guidance, without which this report would not be possible. And finally, just a bit of brief housekeeping in the format for this webinar. We're going to hear, as I say, from Malcolm and Charlie and then Lucy, and we'll have about 15 or 20 minutes for questions at the end. So please get your thinking caps on and use the question and answer function in the Teams chat, which will be able to sort of make sure we get any questions to the right members of the panel. This webinar is also being recorded and we'll make a link available at the end of the week for anyone who wants to rewatch this or share it with a colleague. So without further ado, can I hand over to Charlie to talk through the report?
Thanks, Harry, and welcome everyone. It's amazing to have so many people joining this call and a wonderful testimony to the importance of this particular topic. I'm really delighted to be able to introduce our brand new Gone International, a new generation report. It's quite a big, meaty report, so I'm only able to sort of pull out and run through some of the key findings today because we want to make sure that we have a chance for Malcolm and Lucy to offer their reflections and also a chance for some questions and answers at the end. So without further ado, I will kick off then. So just in terms of giving some context to the report and the key research objectives, again, I'd like to really reiterate our thanks to Jisc and Northern Consortium, who've been both generous and excellent partners to work with on this report. So big thanks indeed. As Harry said, Gone International New Generation is the latest edition in our series of Gone International reports, and it builds on research that we last did in 2019. It looks at which students go abroad, what types of placements they undertake when they are abroad, and what impact these mobility experiences have on both their academic and their graduate and employment outcomes and future earnings. A refresh has been quite long overdue. As Harry said, there's been a lot of change within the external landscape. When we last did the research in 2019, it was the time of the EU referendum, and we were using the Gone International research to really make the case around the value of mobility and the importance of the UK government making alternative provisions if we decided not to participate in Erasmus. And I think in terms of that kind of external context, a refresh is really timely now, because the UK is at a bit of another crossroads with respect to mobility. So we've got Turing scheme funding for the current year extended for another year, but budgets for the Turing scheme for 2026 onwards will be decided as part of the June spending review. And at the same time, we know that the UK is looking to strike a new deal with Europe, and we expect that Erasmus is likely to form part of those conversations from the EU side. So we thought it was really important to really refresh the evidence base around the impact of mobility, with the aim of ensuring that we make sure that we have a generous and long-term funding settlement for mobility. So key questions that we wanted to answer as part of the research were: what impact have recent changes had on the rates of mobility participation and numbers of students going abroad? Does mobility still benefit students? What progress have we made in terms of widening access to mobility opportunities in recent years? And does it still benefit students from less advantaged backgrounds? And just to note that while we looked at those benefits rather narrowly through the lens of academic and employment outcomes, because we know these data had the most traction with the UK Treasury, clearly this is only one lens that we can use when we're looking at the individual and social benefits of mobility. So things like language skills, global citizenship, and the soft power impacts, for example. These are all really important factors, but they were somewhat outside the scope of this particular research. Turning then to sort of consider data and methodology. So the research uses data from two Jisc data sets, the student record and the graduate outcomes survey. And what we did is we linked individual records within the two data sets to track the outcomes of students who've been mobile during their degree. And then we benchmarked these against the outcomes of students who were not mobile during their degree. As with earlier reports, we focused on full-time UK domiciled undergraduate first degree students. So that was the kind of key cohort for the research. And whilst we focused on the most recent cohort for whom we had data, so that was the cohort that graduated in 2021, 2022, we also tracked some high-level trends and 5-year averages across the 4 previous cohorts from 2017, 2018, to get a sense of what's happened in the intervening years. So turning then just to sort of the report findings, in the first part of the report, we looked at how many students go abroad, we looked at changes over time, and we looked at the characteristics of students that go abroad, including the participation rates of students from less advantaged and historically underrepresented groups. And in terms of the sort of overall trends in outward student mobility, then the data showed that we saw there an initial increase in outward mobility in 2018-19, when mobility rates grew to actually 8.8% of the student cohort. But then we see mobility dropping off sharply, falling to just 3.5% of the cohort in 2021-2022. So this was quite a stark decline, both in actual numbers and the rate of participation of students going abroad. And in terms of some of the reasons that we could account for this, we think that Brexit and the new immigration rules that came into effect from the 1st of January 2021 will have had some bearing on this. But because most undergraduate students are mobile in the penultimate year of study, they were somewhat less impacted by this. So we think that the pandemic was the sort of chief driver for some of these declines that we see within the data. When we looked at the trends in outward mobility, looking at it broken down by UK nation, we saw that mobility declined sharply for all UK nations, with rates falling to around 35 to 40% of what they'd been 5 years earlier. And we can see that Northern Ireland here suffered the sharpest drop. What we did see, however, is that the relative ranking of the 4 nations remained the same during this period, with students studying at English universities being the least mobile and those in Northern Ireland being the most mobile. And we saw that students in Scotland and Welsh institutions had quite high rates of mobility as well. For the Northern Ireland data, we think that cross-border flows of students between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland might account for the high rates that we see in Northern Ireland. And in Scotland, we think that the 4-year undergraduate degree structure and the later specialisation that affords may account in part for the high numbers in Scotland and make it easier for students to go abroad. I think it's also worth noting at this point that the Welsh Tithe programme was launched in 2022. So whilst it's a very important funding instrument, no Tithe students were captured within this data set. But obviously, if we were to redo this research in future, we'd obviously want to account for that. When we looked at the types of placements that students undertake, we saw that most students went abroad for study. So that's the blue bars there, followed by work in red and volunteering in green. And that was obviously true across all 5 years. But we can also see that during this time frame, work abroad grew in popularity, rising from almost 22% of mobilities to almost 26% over that 5-year period. We can see that the growth in work abroad took some share away from study abroad, with volunteering remaining fairly stable. And perhaps this is accounted for by a sort of increased focus on students on kind of employment and postgraduate employability. When we looked at the types of, sorry, I'm just trying to move the slides there. There we go. Then we looked at the types of schemes being used. We saw that provider-led placements, that includes mobilities that are arranged by the university and which may or may not be funded by the university. They made up the highest proportion of mobilities in all years except 21-22, when Erasmus slightly overtook them. And after provider placements, Erasmus placements were the next largest category within the data series. So important to note that although 2020 was the last Erasmus funding call that the UK was able to participate in, obviously the funding projects were for 2 or 3 years. So Erasmus funding was, universities were able to use Erasmus funding throughout this time period. Turing scheme launched in 2021, so only that final 2021-22 cohort had access to Turing funding, so that accounts for the relatively small share of Turing funding that we see here. But I think we'd expect to see that shift from Erasmus to Turing in subsequent cohorts. And what we see here is that provider placements saw the largest drop in share across the 5 years. And we think that this is because a lot of provider placements are short-term placements, which may have been somewhat easier to cancel or postpone during the pandemic than medium or longer term mobilities, which are more likely to be core learning. When we looked at mobility durations, we grouped placements into 3 durational categories, which are based on where we saw peaks in recorded durations. So long-term mobilities of 16 weeks or more, medium-term mobilities of 4 to 15 weeks, and short-term mobilities of 1 to 3 weeks. We saw that long-term mobility was the most common type across all 5 years in the period, but what we also saw there is that short-term mobility grew to make up almost 28% of mobilities in 2019-20, before declining slightly in the last 2 cohorts. And we think this is more likely to be an effect of the pandemic rather than some kind of fundamental change in demand, and the rationale being there that, as I said, medium and long-term placements, which would include semester and year abroad, are often compulsory and integrated learning and might have been more insulated from the pandemic's effects. Other trends that we saw were also that short-term placements were more popular amongst students from Asian, Black and other ethnic backgrounds, and they were also more common amongst students from socioeconomically less advantaged backgrounds. So these data really highlight the positive role of short-term mobility in widening access. The top 3 destinations for short-term mobility were all in Europe, but outside Europe we saw the US, China and Malaysia being key destinations for short-term mobilities. And this slide really just supports that previous point. We can see here the higher level of demand amongst students from Asian, Black and other ethnic backgrounds for short-term placements, relatively speaking. And this slide also shows the data broken down by levels of advantage. So we can see here that students in the SEC 4 to 8 grouping, so students coming from the least advantaged households, were consistently more likely to undertake short-term mobilities than their more advantaged peers in all 5 years. I think Whereas this group undertook medium-term mobility at comparable rates to their more advantaged periods, they were less likely, as we can see, to undertake long-term placements. So I think that whilst these data really indicate that short-term mobility is incredibly useful in widening access, at the same time, we do need to understand and address barriers to students from less advantaged backgrounds in undertaking longer-term placements. And I think it's also worth noting here that short-term mobility can also be a useful stepping stone into longer-term placements as well. When we looked at where students go abroad, unsurprisingly, the most common region within the dataset was Europe, with 59% of mobilities taking place in Europe across the 5-year period. Europe's share actually increased to 72% of mobilities in 2021-2022, and we think this might have been because it was somewhat easier to go abroad and continue to go abroad and undertake placements in Europe than destinations farther afield during the pandemic. Asia was the second most common destination, overtaking North America in 2021-22, which had been second most common destination. And as we can see from the data, the Middle East was the region that hosted the fewest students within this time series. And then when we looked, we sort of also broke down the key destinations broken down by scheme, and we could see some quite significant variations across the different mobility schemes here. Unsurprisingly, perhaps all of the top 10 Erasmus destinations were in Europe. Provider-led mobilities were a bit more spread out and include the key English-speaking destinations, the US, Australia and Canada, as well as some key countries in East Asia. And the top 10 Turing scheme destinations included some surprises, including Fiji, Sri Lanka, Uganda and Malta. So this was really interesting to see. And obviously the global aspect of the Turing scheme is a key feature of the programme. When we looked at widening participation in mobility opportunities has been a really key priority for the UK higher education sector, and it's also a really key policy parameter for the UK Turing scheme. So we wanted to try to evaluate progress and to understand if mobility opportunities have become more or less equitable over time. So when we looked at widening participation, so we compared the mobility rates for widening participation students with those of more advantaged students in the most recent cohort. And pleasingly, we found that disabled students now participate at rates that are comparable to their non-disabled peers, which is a really big step forward, I think. When we broke the data down by ethnicity, the data showed that students from mixed ethnic backgrounds participated the most, but Black and Asian students participated least. And for all other widening participation cohorts, we found gaps in participation compared with their more advantaged peers. So I think this shows that there's clearly some more work to be done in terms of expanding access. In order to understand any changes and whether mobility had become more or less equitable over time, we looked at changes in the share of overall mobility for each category, and we found that for several student groups, the share of mobility overall actually increased during this period. So this included students from Asian, Black and mixed ethnic backgrounds, students from low participation neighbourhoods and disabled students. So these were very positive findings. For care leavers, students from other ethnic backgrounds and less advantaged students, the proportions remained broadly steady. And for students whose parents had no higher education qualifications and those from state-funded school backgrounds, their share actually declined. So clearly a bit of a mixed picture there. Some progress evidence for some groups, but more work to do for others. In the second section of the report, we looked at mobile students' academic outcomes and used the graduate outcomes survey data to track their employment outcomes. And when we looked at academic outcomes, the data showed that students who were mobile had better academic outcomes than their non-mobile peers. And this was consistent in all 5 years that we studied. So as a 5-year average, mobile students were 8.1 percentage points more likely to be awarded a first-class degree. And this actually increased to 12 percentage points for the most recent 2021-22 cohort. And happily, the research showed that this uplift for mobile students held true for students in all of the WP categories analysed. And more remarkable still was the finding that even short-term mobilities were associated with better academic outcomes. So that was really positive to see. When we looked at graduate employment and we looked at what students were doing 15 months after completing their course. The data showed that students who were mobile were less likely to be unemployed and more likely to be employed in a professional level job than their non-mobile peers in all 5 years that we studied. So 4.7% of mobile graduates were unemployed versus 5.1% of non-mobile graduates when we looked at this as a 5-year average. And when we looked at professional level job rates as a 5-year average, 75.9% of mobile graduates were in professional level jobs compared with 72% of non-mobile graduates. So a substantial difference there. And again, this also held true for those that had done a short-term mobility. So on the right, you can see that short-term mobile graduates are less likely to be unemployed and more likely to be in a professional level job than those who hadn't had a period of mobility during their degree. I think, again, this was really important. Previously, we've been able to field really good evidence in terms of the impact of short-term mobility, in terms of participant feedback and student self-reported benefits. But I think to be able to see these data in hard data was really positive. We also looked at graduate earnings, and again we found that overall mobile students had higher graduate earnings than non-mobile students across all 5 years of the study, and as a 5-year average, mobile graduate salaries were 1.6% higher than non-mobile graduates. And when we looked at the most recent 21-22 cohort, we can see that mobile graduates are actually 2.2% higher than for non-mobile graduates. Again, positive finding. And then we broke the graduate salary data by widening participation cohorts. And we can see that as a 5-year average, the salary of mobile graduates compared with non-mobile graduates was higher for mobile Asian and Black graduates, those from low participation neighbourhoods, state-funded schools, and less advantaged backgrounds, as well as mature students and care leavers. The 5-year average salaries of mobile graduates were lower for graduates from mixed and other ethnic backgrounds, and also part-time graduates. And then we also looked at this, did a deep dive into the 2021-22 data. And when we looked at this data set, the only group for whom average mobile graduate salaries were lower than non-mobile graduates was for graduates from other ethnic backgrounds. So that sort of basically wraps up the main findings from the research, and there's obviously a lot more detailed data in the full report, so we really strongly encourage you to download the report, which is published today, and we're going to share the link at the end of the session. But to just summarise quickly some of the key conclusions that we took away from the research. So we saw that there's been a significant decline in mobility, which we linked to the pandemic and other factors. This is a really worrying reversal of some of the progress we've made as a nation in terms of growing outward student mobility, and it really needs our attention and the concerted effort of universities and policymakers to really regrow opportunities for students over the coming years. In terms of access, the data show that for some student characteristics, opportunities have become more equitable, even as mobility opportunities have declined, but progress is uneven, and we can see that disparities remain for many groups. So that's also something that needs to be a focus in future. The research pleasingly shows that mobile students have better academic and employment outcomes than their non-mobile peers. So this really highlights a clear role for global mobility in supporting social mobility. And relatedly, although we often see that outward mobility can play sort of second fiddle in terms of strategic importance placed on it than inward student mobility, the research shows clearly how it can deliver against both the government's skills, economic growth and social mobility goals, and so it should remain a priority for universities and policymakers alike. And finally, just to note that while this research focused very much on physical mobility, it's really important to recognise the role that internationalisation at home activity, so sort of virtual mobility, blended mobility and COIL, for example, these can play a really important and complementary role in expanding access to opportunities. So just to make that really clear. And then building off the back of the findings, we made 4 broad recommendations. The first was that outward student mobility should be a key component of the international education strategies of the UK government and also those of the devolved governments. The second was that the government should provide generous long-term funding for outward student mobility, whether that's through the Turing scheme or future participation in Erasmus. But students really rely on there being funding to support going abroad, and it's key to regrowing this activity. Third, that to be able to understand and evaluate the impact of mobility schemes, we need a consistent approach to data and reporting, including comprehensive reporting on short-term mobilities and regular programme evaluation. And finally, just that widening participation really needs to continue to lie at the heart of the UK's approach to outward student mobility, both in terms of the design of mobility programmes and in terms of the design and structuring of mobility funding instruments. And this obviously links to the recommendation around data reporting and evaluation as well. So hopefully this has been useful as a bit of a whistle-stop tour of the key findings, but please do download the report and help us disseminate it, and do put your questions in the chat for our Q&A. But I'm going to stop talking now and pass over to our colleagues from Jisc and Northern Consortium.
Thank you ever so much, Charlie. That was incredibly helpful and like you say, covered a huge range of topics and areas in a very short space of time. I know we have started to get some questions in the Q&A function, but as a reminder to colleagues, please, if anything Charlie's said there has prompted some thoughts, please make sure you're sort of putting some questions in the chat. But without further ado, I will now pass over to Malcolm from the Northern Consortium.
Thank you very much, and good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're dialing in from. I'm Malcolm Butler, as introduced. I am the chair of Northern Consortium, chair of the Board of Trustees. I also happen to be the Vice President International at the University of Sheffield. First of all, I must say thank you again to Charlie for an excellent presentation, and to all of those involved in preparing the work. There's a lot of work, a lot of data analysis has gone to providing it such a concise summary that is there. I say concise, but there is a huge amount in that report, as Charlie said, to take away and consider. So please do that and analyse it. But I do think, you know, the majority of it is overwhelmingly positive in supporting what we want to do and what we want to encourage. As I've said, I'm representing the Northern Consortium, who helped to fund this, and we're delighted to be doing that because really the Northern Consortium is a charity that supports access to higher education from an international perspective to the UK, and was set up in 1993 by a group of universities. And clearly you can see, obviously yourselves, I suspect, how this report helps to deliver that and to evidence the value of doing that in this particular area of student mobility. I also think it gives us a great deal more quantification compared to following on from the previous report. So my job really today is to give a few reflections on this from various perspectives, and I do think that there are three areas: both the benefits to the individuals, which are well articulated in the report in terms of academic and career benefits, to the university and how that interacts with what we do as universities, but also to the country as a whole, whether that be about the economy or to our position in the world, should we say. So as I say, I think the benefits of student mobility have been well understood. I think they're well evidenced in the report. I think it's particularly pleasing the uplift that's seen for less advantaged and underrepresented students. I think that's really important. And worth emphasising again that we get a lot of that even with short-term mobilities. And I think that's important to us as a university when we're thinking about how we deliver a greater number of student mobilities with ever decreasing resources. But shorter term allows us to impact on more students, and the benefits are still significant, as has been seen. I think it also serves for me to remind you that it's not just the academic and career benefits that individuals get from this. We know that mobility overseas has a significant impact on people in terms of their confidence, their resilience, their cultural awareness, and will support them for the rest of their lives. Many quote student mobility as a life-changing or transformative experience, and it is dictated what they've done with the rest of their lives. So it's a lot more than just the hard facts you see. I think also as a university, we mustn't forget that student mobilities are often reciprocal. This allows the flow of students in two directions and therefore benefits the wider community of the university by bringing individuals to the university, to the UK, and so on. And they give that kind of a cultural mix within the university, which benefits all students. Equally, those students who study abroad come back with their experience and their stories and their ideas and their ambitions, which they share with fellow students. So again, delivers to the wider student community and is a benefit for us. I do think, as I say, you can't forget the soft power that mobility does in terms of the UK's position or the UK's economy. I regularly meet alumni who have kept in touch with where they have been from, whether that just be friends or actually maintaining links, doing businesses, setting up companies. It does have a long-term impact. We know as well the global significance. Youth mobility is currently being discussed with Europe again, and I think that's a global recognition of the importance and how much nations value what can be achieved with this. So I think it's really clear to me that what the report says, it illustrates the diverse benefits, what can be achieved over both short and long-term mobilities, and the fact that there's always more to learn as well, and I think how we monitor this and the benefits and the wider benefits it delivers will be important going forward, as said by Charlie. I think that despite the decline in numbers and something that we'd all like to reverse, the impact on the widening participation, the underrepresented, and so on has really made a difference there. And you can see the real benefits there, and we know that's something we'll focus on. So I do hope, and I do believe, and I'm confident that this report will make an impact going forward. Like previous ones, it will be used as evidence, both for convincing policymakers to support this, to persuading funders to fund it, and to enable those delivering student mobility to grow this invaluable activity that, as I've said, we know delivers for the individual, for the university, and for the country as a whole. Plus, as I said, it delivers what we, Northern Consortium, believe as important in terms of its access to higher education. So I look forward to engaging with the question and answer session. Thank you for listening, and thank you again to everyone who's provided the evidence of the report and pulled it all together and presented it so concisely. Thank you.
And thank you, Malcolm. I think that was super helpful and really interesting. I think the point you made is a really good one around the fact that actually we obviously hope this report is immensely valuable to our members, and I can see that in the chat and I can see lots of colleagues are finding it hugely useful. But I also think it's important for policymakers to make the point that actually this evidence, this data is vital to actually remake the case for outbound mobility and supporting students to have those type of experiences. So thank you, Malcolm. And last but by no means least, Lucy, can I hand over to yourself?
Thank you, Harry. Okay, I'm just going to give a few very brief comments about Jisc's role in the work, about the data that underpinned the Gone International report, and a little bit about how we in the data sector can respond to a changing climate and changing data needs. So starting off with a bit about Jisc's role in the work. First, I think the biggest thing that we did was that we were able to supply the data to the UUKi team. So that data supply came through Jisc's tailored datasets service, which is for anyone who's interested in using HESA Jisc data for research purposes. That's the main route for accessing more granular data than you can find on the HESA website in the open data. There's a huge amount of data available openly on the HESA website, but the website doesn't have everything that we collect. So if you want to get into some more detailed fields, as the UUKi team needed to here, the best way to do that is often to go through the tailored datasets team, which is part of our data analytics function. The other thing that we did for the project is we had a multidisciplinary team of Jisc colleagues who worked with UUKi to review findings and offer feedback. So that was a team that included our head of surveys, who runs the graduate outcomes survey, a member from our data analytics team, our graduate labour market expert, and myself. I'm part of the HESA policy team. So we all worked together, brought some different perspectives into the report and the analysis, and it was, I hope, a fruitful collaboration. I know we as Jisc were really honoured to be part of this kind of cross-sector collaboration. And we think that this is one of the really important things we can do as the sector data body, is to get involved in the analysis and dissemination of the data that we collect. On the data itself, right, Charlie mentioned that the report built on a data set which consisted of linked HESA student and graduate outcomes data. These are two of our really high-profile data sets. And publications based on both of them have been audited by the Office for Statistics Regulation and accredited as accredited official statistics. So that's the OSR's sort of highest stamp of validity and quality. So we're very proud of both of these collections. The HESA student data that we included in this data set covered personal characteristics, also degree outcomes, which I didn't put on the slide, right, and a number of different fields about student mobility. So the type of mobility, Charlie mentioned this division between study abroad, work abroad, volunteering abroad, duration, we've got how many weeks or days were students abroad, and also the mobility scheme, so looking at provider-run schemes, sandwich placements, Erasmus Plus, touring. Now, although not in the GON International dataset, we now also have data on the new Welsh Tithe scheme and also other kinds of mobility schemes. The Graduate Outcomes Survey data covers activity 15 months after course completion, so that's whether graduates are in work, whether they're in further study, whether they're volunteering, whether they're doing something else. For those graduates who are in work, we look at level of employment, so that's looking at standard occupational classification, and that's how we get this distinction between professional level and lower level jobs. So groups 1 to 3, these are going to be people in managerial roles, people in professional and scientific occupations, and people in what gets classified as associate professional occupations, which are often things like research assistants. And those top 3 categories go into the aggregated professional jobs category. We also collect data on salary for graduates in work. And I do also want to say, although it didn't figure in the analysis for this report because Charlie and the team had already taken on an awful lot to analyze, so this is no criticism of them. The Graduate Outcomes Survey does also collect some data on other ways of thinking about outcomes that aren't just about employment and salary, although we know that those outcomes are important. We do also look at how graduates feel about what they're doing 15 months out of university. Do they feel that what they're doing supports their future plans? Are they satisfied with what they're doing? All right, and my last slide here looks at how we can understand mobility as the context that we're working in changes. HESA, as many of you know, collect data on higher education in the UK on behalf of our statutory customers in all 4 UK nations. So that's in England, the Office for Students and the DFE, and also UKRI and Research England, in Wales, MEDR and the Welsh Government. Similarly, in Scotland, the Scottish Funding Council and the Scottish Government, and also the Department for the Economy in Northern Ireland. So we're a UK-wide data body. We have obligations to all 4 nations. And the data that we collect on behalf of our statutory customers can change to meet user needs as our statutory customers understand changing needs in a changing context. We can update what we collect as guided by the sector and as guided by our customers. So we do now have fields in the student dataset reflecting these relatively new Turing and Tithe funding schemes. Those have just come in the last few years, and our data collection has responded to reflect those. And I think there's something similar that is possible but hasn't happened yet around short-term mobility. At the current moment, it's mandatory for providers to report on mobilities of more than 4 weeks. They're encouraged to report on shorter-term mobilities, but that's at the moment optional. One thing that's happened since the pandemic is that the Turing funding scheme has started funding student mobilities of 2 to 4 weeks. So that those are shorter term mobilities than used to be funded by the government. And that means that we've got a potential gap in some government funded student mobility that for those shorter term mobilities where reporting data is still optional. We haven't yet been given a steer from our statutory customers to adapt the threshold for collection of data. But if they start feeling that there is a need for data on those shorter term government funded mobility schemes, I think there's a possibility that we'd be able to adjust what the requirements there and start collecting more comprehensive data on short-term mobilities, which, as Charlie has said, will just help deepen our understanding of the kind of mobilities that students are going on, what kind of students are going on which sorts of mobility placements, and what are the impacts of those shorter term mobilities. This isn't something that we, HISA, can do unilaterally, but as we become aware of a need on the parts of users of our data, we can respond accordingly. And I think that's it from me. All right, there's one more slide with an encouragement to get in touch with the Jisc team if you have any questions about the work that we do and what we can do in the data space. But otherwise, that's it. And I'll pass over to you again, Harry. Thank you.
No, thank you, Lucy. That's super helpful for sort of talking us and walking us through that so clearly. Colleagues, it's now the opportunity to open this up to sort of Q&As. I know there's been a number of questions asked in the chat already, and we'll try and get through as many of those as possible. But perhaps if I can sort of take chair's privilege and sort of ask a few questions just to kick off myself. And perhaps the first to Charlie. You obviously sort of talked about the length of mobility being important in terms of access, but what do you think are some of the kind of key barriers still to sort of to mobility for students from less advantaged backgrounds?
Thanks, Harry. Yeah, good, a good warm-up question. So I think, I think historically research has shown that financial barriers are a key factor, and have really affirmed the importance of there being grant funding to mitigate the cost burden on students. So that's really important. And I think it's likely to be a number one issue still, and might have been exacerbated by things like the cost of living increase and the fact that we see that more students are having to work alongside their studies. So there's not just the cost of studying abroad, but also the lost earnings to consider. So I think in that context, short-term mobility and blended placements are actually a really good development and can help mitigate some of this. But I think it's also important not to underestimate the importance of good, timely advice and guidance, as that helps students plan and manage their finance. And also to understand their entitlements to additional grant funding under schemes like Turing and Tithe. I think in that context, I think we'd really like to see the Turing scheme move to a multi-year model with earlier confirmation of grant funding, so that students are applying for funding that's already there rather than doing it speculatively. And I think that can help students make plans earlier in advance. I think there's obviously also cultural barriers can also play a role, and research shows that. I think students really have to feel like this is something for me, and to know that they're also going to be safe and supported. And in that respect, and this is something that's come out through our Outward Student Mobility Network sessions, it's really important for mobility teams to work closely with student support and wellbeing teams to make sure that students have access to the right support systems when they're abroad. We've also, on that note, seen members talking about how they can offer a range of international experience types of activities, so that sort of mobility experience can be scaffolded. So starting small with things like sort of on-campus events and internationalisation at home activity that can kind of help them build confidence and encourage students to go on to undertake a physical mobility. So I think there's a kind of, there are kind of a mixture of practical and cultural barriers still, but there are also new ways of tackling that, and a lot of innovation that we're seeing in the sector.
That's great. Thanks very much, Charlie. And perhaps Malcolm, turning to yourself, obviously you're wearing a sort of dual hat today in terms of both the Northern Consortium and your role at Sheffield, but perhaps thinking more about the institutional perspective, do you think there's any kind of key reflections or takeaways that university leaders should be taking from this report when thinking about their own sort of universities or international strategies?
Yes, but in a positive way, actually. I mean, this is supporting what universities believe in, if you like, so this is preaching to the converted in one respect. But as I said, I think the evidence and the quantification it gives is really valuable, because it supports the competition for resources. We know money's tight in universities, where it sits in the strategy of the university, but also being able to demonstrate the value it does give to students, is really quite key, not only to us as universities and to those involved in the different areas and how we divide up students' time, but also to the students themselves who are going to come here. Lots with hindsight absolutely know the benefits and will wax lyrical about it, but those who haven't yet done it, especially maybe those who are nervous about it or who are less keen on it, which again tends to be those who haven't had the opportunities, the underrepresented, those from less advantaged backgrounds and so on. So it does give us some clear things that we can use for those, if you like, groups to persuade those who are persuaded, but also maybe those who are less certain of it. So yeah, it's really valuable. And as I say, the previous reports get quoted on a regular basis by myself and by many of my peers at other universities.
That's great. Thanks, Malcolm. And hopefully that will remain the case for the latest iteration of this report too. Lucy, I'm conscious we've got a lot of data questions that are coming through in the Q&A. I don't know if there's sort of any ones that particularly jump out at you that you would like to sort of answer, but I think there's one that I've seen, or at least that's come up a couple of times here, about whether the type of placements included in sort of study work and volunteering includes summer schools. Now, I don't know if that's something you can answer or if you can sort of expand on that at all.
I first have to say that I've been sort of frantically looking through the coding manual to try to figure this one out as we've been listening here. And I think the short answer is that I suspect the answer is sometimes, and it will depend on the funding scheme, that if you have a centrally funded summer school or a summer school run by that you have funding for through your provider, that will probably get included in the data. But if you, as a student, sort of your own initiative, without telling your provider about it, just sign yourself up for a summer school, that may not make its way into the HESA data. This is sort of my best guess at the moment, but I'm going to get in touch with some colleagues offline and try to get back to you on this. But I know that you can do touring or TIFE-funded summer activities, so those activities will make their way into the data, again, depending on length of mobility. But I don't know how consistently all between term engagements will make their way in.
That's fine, and I think as ever these things are complicated. So no, that's some helpful clarification at least, and anything further you can get on that I think would be useful. Charlie, there's a question here about I suppose how important do you think sort of this report and the evidence that we're presenting in this report is going to be in terms of the EU-UK talks, I suppose, particularly given there's a lot of chat recently about a one-year youth mobility scheme. And do you think this report can sort of help, I suppose, in sort of showing to the UK government and the EU governments that actually, reciprocal mobility is in everyone's interest?
Yes, definitely. I think that was very much in the forefront of our minds when we were, commissioning and developing the research. I mean, I think the approach in the research, as you've seen, is although we do break down, we do look at scheme types, it's fairly scheme agnostic when we look at things like the sort of graduate outcomes. So it's very much there. As I said at the beginning, in terms of where we are now, we're very much at a turning point, I think, with the current CSR period coming to an end and touring budgets being revised. So for us, it was really important that we first and foremost, we build a very clear case for why government should fund this activity. And I think this research can be an incredibly useful tool, both in terms of it's already become a very useful tool. We used interim findings and fed into the autumn budget last October. And I think it's been a really useful tool in terms of feeding into some of our ask in relation to the CSR in June. But I think it also builds a good foundation to start from if there is a sort of policy window and an opportunity to look at and feed into any discussions around future participation in Erasmus. I mean, obviously the Gone International research looks at outwards mobility cohorts, But that's in terms of kind of UK government size, that's where a lot of the kind of derived value of mobility partnerships is seen. So but that's notwithstanding that, it's kind of key evidence to support kind of two-way exchange and mobility through potentially through future Erasmus participation.
That's great. Thanks very much, Charlie. There's also another data question here. So perhaps looking over towards you, Lucy, around it's a question from Jan around what is the reasoning behind having one Asian ethnicity group in this report, and whether there's a possibility to sort of differentiate between different domiciles, nationalities within that grouping. So be it, Chinese, South Asian, Bangladesh, Pakistani, etc. Do you know if that's possible in terms of the data or not?
Well, in terms of the data, we do collect more granular ethnicity data. And I don't know what level of granularity was included in the data supply. We very often, in a lot of our publications and analyses, do have to aggregate categories, including ethnicity, down to slightly broader categories, because once you start splitting these categories by the factors that are involved in the analysis, you quite quickly end up with very small numbers. If you're looking at, say, Chinese students with no parental experience of higher education who either did or did not participate in mobility schemes, and Chinese students might be a fairly large ethnic group, so that wasn't necessarily a great example. But in order to keep our analysis at a level where we can draw some robust conclusions, it's often more practical to do some groupings. I think there could be a case in this here that there is a policy interest in looking at specific outcomes and participation by more granular ethnic groups, and that could be done if the data ended up supporting it. That more granular ethnicity marker is in the data. The question would just be whether you'd break down to unanalysably small groups.
That's helpful, thank you. And perhaps just, if I can, staying with you, Lucy, there's a question from Fiona O'Carroll talking about interested in the data collection for the report and how shorter mobilities perhaps won't appear often in the HESA data. And I think that's one of the points that we've made in the recommendations of the report. But I don't know if you think there are other gaps that are can sometimes appear in the data here, and what we should be sort of thinking about or focused on.
No, so I think shorter term mobility is the most obvious gap, is that sort of under 4 weeks optional collection where providers can report those mobilities to us, but they aren't required to. I think the question about summer school activity and sort of various less formal mobility is a good one. And while I think there are going to be some mobilities in that category that do make their way into the record, there will certainly be categories of international experiences that students have that they may not report to their universities and will still influence their experience of being a student and their paths possibly towards employment. Those are still valuable experiences, but there isn't necessarily a direct line to the provider around what students are doing. So that could be another gap. I think also, Charlie mentioned internationalization at home and various sort of things that students are doing without leaving the UK that connect them to a sense of an international world. And those we have no way of collecting data on at the minute, and may be a deciding factor in some choices that students make along the way.
No, that's great. Thanks, Lucy. And Malcolm, turning to yourself, there's a question here about, I suppose, kind of encouraging more students to get involved in short-term placements and activities. And the question really is, do you think that recognition, sort of greater recognition, as we've perhaps just been alluding to and touching on, like credit transfer or other things, would encourage more students to take part in short-term mobilities, which could obviously then, help improve the data and the recognition that we have in this space?
Yeah, I think so. In some cases, it absolutely could. Certainly, at Sheffield, we do credit bearing courses, non-credit bearing courses. I do think the challenges in the area you're just talking about in terms of the summer schools, the circumstantial evidence is that the 2-week placements do have a benefit, just like the longer ones. So we're missing a trick by not capturing that data, but that still means they're a good thing to do. And many universities do a lot of activity in this area. And as I said previously, shorter term impacts on more students by definition per pound spent, so to speak. So yeah, I think where we can get formal recognition is good. Certainly we're doing that. And whether it persuades more students, I think yes, in some cases, because they want to make sure they seem to be getting the value out of what they're doing. And it kind of gives it obviously an official recognition. But so many of the benefits are things that the individual gets themselves that actually it's not a barrier to getting those benefits for that it's got credit recognition or whatever. But it might just help persuade some areas, some groups of students of the importance of it or the validity of it. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point, in that actually the benefits are quite clear from this report and the evidence, and so actually, yeah, it's perhaps just the encouragement rather than the sort of validity. Perhaps just sort of time for one final question, and it does feel sort of slightly bizarre to ask this, given we're on the day of the launch of the latest report, but clearly there's a sort of lot of interest in the analysis and the data, and we've done this report at a period of time in which there is a lot of change, and that we've only just started to see data on the sort of Turing scheme, for example. But perhaps looking towards Charlie, do you think this is something that we would want to sort of revisit in future, in terms of looking to continue to track this evidence and this data, so that we can make a case about the importance of mobility and update it as part of a regular series of analysis and reports in this space? I think I probably know the answer, but over to you.
Thanks, Harry. I think obviously it's been a really it's a chunky piece of work, and in this, unlike previous reports were just slice in time 1-year analysis, and what's unusual about the Garden International New Generation report is that it actually tracks time series over a 5-year period. So it's quite it's a substantial piece of work, and I think in being able to contextualize the findings for the 2021-22 cohort in the context of the 5-year averages, there's some pretty compelling and strong data there around the graduate outcomes. So I'm not sure that we have the capacity to do something on a sort of annual basis, but I do think it's very, very important that we that we continue to make sure that we have this valid up-to-date evidence base to make the arguments around the impact. What I do think we should be doing and have potential to do is to look at use the HESA student record data sets to track some of that kind of more trends, rather than the kind of graduate outcomes element, but to track trends in outward student mobility, and to link that through to the sort of impact that we see of sort of transition onto different funding schemes and post-Brexit. So as we see in the report, not all of that was captured due to the fact we had to stop at 21-22. I think there's more we can do in future, looking at to kind of use the student record to track some of those impacts, and I think we can also usefully link that together with data on inbound students as well, to understand the impact of some of the changes in the policy environment. But yeah, very much want to make sure that this is not just a one-off in future, and that we have good solid evidence to support our lobbying.
Thanks, Charlie. No, and I think that's a really important point. We need to sort of make sure that we always do have the evidence to sort of put forward to policymakers, to internal colleagues within our institutions, to demonstrate the value of this type of activity. I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. So thank you everyone for joining us and for your questions and engagement in today's webinar. In particular, I want to sort of put on record my thanks again to Charlie, to Malcolm and to Lucy for their time and their reflections, And I also want to reiterate my thanks again to the Northern Consortium and to Jisc for making this research possible in the first place. As mentioned, a recording of this will be made available and shared with attendees by the end of the week, and the report is now available on our website. But otherwise, thank you ever so much for joining us today, and we'll wrap up there.